Welcome. This is Jack Zenger. I'm here with my colleague, Joe Folkman,
Hello.
and we're here to talk with you today about how feedback helps us succeed. We think feedback is an extremely valuable practice. Uh, we acknowledge that it can have negative consequences if done improperly or if contaminated, but we think it's a lot like water. It's basically a very fundamentally wonderful thing. And unfortunately, there have been some things published of late which have called into question that assumption. So, just quickly, the objectives of today's webinar are these. We want to share with you our views and some research about feedback. We want to correct some false statements and assumptions that were expressed in a Harvard Business Review article that was in their March-April issue. And finally, we want to conclude by sharing with you some ideas about how we can improve the whole practice of giving and receiving feedback in organizations. So, what's triggered this discussion is the article mentioned by Marcus Buckingham and Ashley Goodall in the recent issue of HBR. The cover kind of described it as why feedback fails. The actual article was titled The Feedback Fallacy. So let's jump right in and talk about what we didn't agree with and why we took issue with some of their conclusions. In the article, they made several assertions, and the first one was, truth is known only by an individual and not by someone else observing their behavior. I think it was back in the mid-1600s that a man named Spinoza said, what Paul says about Peter tells us more about Paul than about Peter. So an early kind of acknowledgement that when one person talks about another, it can certainly be colored by what the teller feels and thinks about this individual, and it isn't totally about the individual. Buckingham and Goodall went on to say, more than half of your rating of someone else reflects your characteristics, not theirs. And then they went on to say feedback is more distortion than truth. Truth is my perception of reality was kind of the fundamental conclusion. We, on the other hand, have a somewhat different view. We think truth is really understanding the reality of what is. In the case of human behavior and human performance, and especially how leaders function and behave, truth includes the observations made by other people about that person's behavior and the impact it has on the organization, especially when that impact can be measured. So truth involves integrating my perceptions with the perceptions of others to uncover what really is the shared reality. Now, Joe, I know you've got some views about this, and so why don't you?
Well, we want to welcome everybody to the philosophy podcast here,
Yeah, right.
where we're talking about what truth is. But, this is really important. And when you think about it, I did some analysis on a piece of research that we did where we looked at ratings from others on a 360 assessment. And we were predicting an outcome, and the outcome we were predicting was growth in sales. And what we found is that when we did that analysis, we found a very strong correlation between a leader's effectiveness, and these are retail sales in stores, and we found that the leaders that were the most effective in a store generated the most significant growth in sales over year-to-year growth versus prior year. So the worst the poorest leaders 0.7 and the best leaders 7.4. And as you look at that graph, you can see that very positive trend, and you can see that line that is the kind of the angle of that line. The more effective a leader is, the better their sales are. Now, if truth is about what you think, we actually ask leaders to rate themselves. And so we have the self data. And if we put that in and say, well, how well does the self data predict? It actually predicts in the opposite direction. The leaders who rated themselves the lowest actually had the highest growth in sales, and it goes the opposite. And you see how random that is, where it bounces all, and you don't see that trend. And so what we found, then as you think about truth, you say, well, what is truth? And you go, well, truth really has a lot to do with positive outcomes, with outcomes that we'd like. And what we found when we looked at this data is that the ratings of others really were very good at predicting this outcome. Let me show you another study. In this other study, what we're predicting is employee engagement. And I don't know if you've ever worked for a really bad boss, but most people that work for a bad boss are disengaged. And what you see on the graph there is you see the correlation between a leader's effectiveness, and these are the ratings of others on 49 behaviors that rate the overall effectiveness of a leader. And this is a study of 90,000 leaders. So this is a very big study. But you can see this fabulous correlation, and you can see the prediction line, the linear line there, that shows the better you are as a leader, the more engaged your employees are. So poor leaders have disengaged employees. Good leaders are okay, but great leaders really make a difference. So let's look at the self predictions. When we just look at the self data, what we see is a fairly flat line. It goes down a little bit at the lower end and up a little bit at the top end. But that difference is that the leaders who are rated the worst by others, they don't see it. And the other side of that is the leaders that are rated the best, the very good leaders, they don't really understand how effective they are and the positive impact that they're making. Again, what we found over and over again is that the predictive data is the data from others. The self-assessments are not as predictive, and we can't really get at that truth like we'd like to. So does feedback include some bias? And the answer is yes. It's hard for any of us to give feedback without bias, right? And Jack started with this quote about Peter and Paul, and you learn more about Peter. Well, there is some bias there. Whenever I give feedback, I have some bias. My wife pointed that out to me last night. But if you thought about perfect feedback, what that would be is that everyone is seeing the same behavior and giving the same precise rating. So we both see the same thing and we rate the same thing. And, that doesn't happen all that often. If we were judging skating, we would both give exactly the same rating, and we hope that those ratings are good. When people rate the same, when people do that, the statistical measure of that is inter-rater reliability. And we found that many of our 360-degree assessments, basically our study finds that about half of the 360 assessments achieve a very good level of inter-rater reliability. But half of them don't. And what that means is that there's raters in there that are giving different kinds of feedback. They're not giving the same kind of feedback. And one would say, well, that's unreliable. Now, I've talked to lots of groups of people and I said, okay, if your boss has some feedback from you, some negative feedback from you, how many of you want to hear it? And speaking to large groups, 99% of the hands go up. I mean, if your boss has something negative that they think about you, do you want to hear it? I think so. I want to hear it. Now, once you hear it, you know, we don't always want to hear it, but people want to know if there's something that's differing. And so if my boss is biased towards me, if I don't ever hear that, then I can't do anything about it. If I hear it, I can do something about it. I can either change my behavior, right? Or I can change my boss's attitude. I can try to say, you know, let me explain this. But that's the way we move forward in life. If we don't have those discussions, then we just get angry or upset or go mope in the corner or whatever. But if your boss thinks you're doing a bad job and you never hear about it, you're going to be in trouble. And hearing about it is much better than not hearing about it. Jack, what's your
to
opinion?
nail this topic down, Joe, I guess it gets back to our beginning here of what is truth. Buckingham and Goodall would say that truth is only known by the leader himself or herself. That a group of people observing that leader's behavior are not the ones who should judge it. But the fact of the matter is, if a bunch of us see this manager screaming and shouting at a subordinate and demeaning this subordinate publicly, I think we can accurately say that this manager is kind of abusive, and his or her behavior is not acceptable. And the truth does not lie in whether or not that abusive leader recognizes it, but it's really what we collectively see. So anyway, that's the first main point that we wanted to make in this discussion. The second one goes on to, as you look at this article by Buckingham and Goodall, that as they described feedback, consistently, it was always messages that were corrective, they were negative, they were fault finding, they were picking, they were telling people what they were doing that was wrong. And we would argue that that's only part of what feedback really is. There's a broader definition of feedback that includes things that are positive, the praise, affirmation, kudos. As Joe pointed out on the slide earlier, many times leaders who are really effective don't know how good they are, and they don't know the things that they do that their people appreciate. And so we would strongly challenge the assumption that all feedback needs to be is negative. We think that's a very small portion of where valuable feedback exists. The other point that was made in this article that we took great exception with was the statement made by Buckingham and Goodall, which is here on the slide that you're seeing. It said, when a feedback instrument surveys 8 colleagues about your business acumen, your score of 3.79 is a far greater distortion than if it simply surveyed one person about you. The number 3.7, the 3.79 number is all noise, no signal. Now, Joe, I'm not a statistician, but this must make your stomach kind of churn. It happens that Buckingham and Goodall had quoted a couple of statisticians and some of their earlier writings about ratings. And these people whom they quote said in their further writing, the advantages of using multiple raters are readily apparent. For each perspective, the use of 2 raters increases the amount of ratee performance captured by about 50%. So it jumps it up another half. When 2 boss, 2 peer, and 2 subordinate ratings are used together, the effects are even more pronounced. the amount of ratee performance variance accounted for increases to 68%. And what we know, Joe, is that in our typical 360-degree practice, the average number of raters is 13 raters. So the amount of valid observations about the behavior of the person in question tends to go up significantly. So we just would point out to all who have heard about or read this article that was just a very egregiously wrong statement.
Yeah, and it's the same authors that say, they make a comment about the reliability of the data, but then they make a comment that if you increase the number of raters, that reliability goes up. And of course, they fail to mention both of those quotes. They do mention the one quote that say that it's distortion. We would contend with that, and we don't agree. Another thing that, as we talk about these feedback preferences, is the idea that giving negative feedback is always bad, and we actually have researched this. We've studied it. We have a little more than opinion here. We actually have data from over 9,000 people. We actually ask people to indicate the extent to which they like to give reinforcing or positive feedback or redirecting or negative feedback, and whether they avoid it, they're neutral, or they like to give it. Interestingly enough, we found that in this self-assessment, 63% of the people had a preference for giving redirecting or negative feedback. That was pretty interesting. And it was interesting also that 37% actually avoided giving reinforcing feedback. Now, that's pretty fascinating, isn't it? You'd think, well, why would you avoid it? This isn't hard to give, telling somebody they're doing a good job, but a lot of people are afraid of that. And we found the majority of people had a stronger preference towards giving redirecting feedback. Here's what's interesting. We ask people themselves to rate themselves on this question. I would rate myself as having as highly effective at providing others with honest, straightforward feedback. And then we looked at the way they responded to that. And then we looked at people that avoid giving positive, avoid negative. And the percentage of people that responded positive to that was 32%. The highest percentage here was the people that had a preference to avoid positive, give negative. 72% rated themselves very high on that particular measure. Those that give positive and avoid negative, only 40%. And those that do both, those that give both positive and negative, that was actually the highest, 78% rated themselves positively on that. So as you look at that graph, what you see is the people that think they're the most effective at giving honest, straightforward feedback are those that give both positive and negative, or those that just tend to focus on the negative feedback. So how do other people view that same activity? Because that was the self-ratings. And again, this is a good example of how self-ratings are distortions. We got data from 465 managers. We correlated it with 360-degree feedback, where we got the feedback from others. We looked at the question, gives honest feedback in a helpful way. And again, as you look at these different groups, those people that avoided giving positive and negative, we're at the 39th percentile. But the high rating group, those that felt like they avoided positive but gave negative, their ratings from others were at the 35th percentile. Those that gave positive and avoided negative were significantly higher at the 49th percentile. And those that gave both positive and negative were at the 49th percentile. What we found here is that again, and this is where we agree with Buckingham, and Goodall, if your preference is, if you're all about negative, that does hurt you. And we do find that people that have that negative preference, and in fact, when we looked at your ability to develop others, we found that same trend, that those that had the preference towards avoiding positive, giving only negative, they were rated the worst at developing others. But interestingly enough, if you just tended to give positive, avoid negative, you were rated higher. But if you gave both positive and negative, and we really think that's the sweet spot. Sometimes people need to hear corrective feedback, and being able to do both gives people, or puts people in a position where they can do both.
Moving on, there's one more area that we'd like to talk about in terms of a misconception that the article presents. They made the following comments. Learning rests on our grasp of what we're doing well, not on what we're doing poorly. Focusing people on their shortcomings doesn't enable learning, it impairs it. And then the final quote that I'd like to be sure you all hear, and that is, telling people what we think of their performance doesn't help them thrive and excel. And telling people how we think they should improve actually hinders learning. Now, the fact of the matter is, we just don't think that that's true. But let's look at the big picture. For 70% of leaders, roughly, we believe they are far better off focusing on building their strengths because they don't have any single behavior that gets in their way or detracts from their performance. But for that 29% of leaders who do have something that we've called kind of a fatal flaw, we strongly believe fatal flaws need to be fixed. It works well when there's some behavior which a leader possesses, which people see because it's so glaring, it's so obvious. It really detracts from their performance. They're kind of known for that. And people who have such behaviors, a fatal flaw, on average are at the 18th percentile when compared to their peers. What we found interesting was to look at leaders who had been told about their fatal flaws, and then kind of to do a test later on, a repeat 360-degree feedback process. And what we found was that those leaders who started at the 18th percentile actually moved up to the 46th percentile. So they made a very significant, like a 28 percentile gain as you compared them to leaders who worked on their strengths and those leaders who began at the 55th percentile. Well, we saw them growing also. They went from the 55th to the 75th percentile. But the point here is this: being told about your weaknesses and deciding to do something about them doesn't impair your learning at all. In fact, the actual percentile gain is greater than those of us who may have the good fortune to be able to work on strengths and not work on our weaknesses.
So this is an area where we have some agreement with them around this idea that the majority of people, they are better off focusing on their strengths. But we also disagree with that's the only way forward. We found that people with fatal flaws need to fix them, but we also found in our research that people with just no strengths, their average effectiveness was a 34th percentile, doing one thing well, boosted their overall effectiveness to the 64th, and doing three things well, it moves their overall effectiveness up to the 81st percentile. So we're strong advocates of strength building. We're strong advocates that people that build their strengths can really make a difference and can have a positive impact. All right. what we found here is that sometimes corrective feedback can be very helpful. The reality is we don't always see what is perfectly obvious to others. We don't often miss it. And I found a lot of times when people have these things we call fatal flaws, they actually, they know about it. Usually they say, yeah, I knew that. But what they didn't realize is how much it was hurting them. They didn't realize the negative impact it has. Now, the good news about it is, and I think the really exciting part is I talk to people, I say, can people fix a fatal flaw? And usually what they don't do is turn it into a profound strength. But what they can do is move it out of that area where it's killing them, where it's destroying them, where it really has that negative effect.
Joe, isn't one of the tough things about the fatal flaw question too, that so often these fatal flaws are not something that they do, but it's something that they don't do.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to always be aware of what you are not doing that so detracts from your performance, because there's nothing you can turn back to and say, oh, I shouted at somebody, or I threw something, or I said something profane, or I took credit where I shouldn't have. So it's not something overt. It's not some overt act that you can kind of correct. It's what you didn't do.
Yeah, more sins of omission than commission, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, can others spot our weaknesses better than we can? Buckingham and Goodall say, we don't know truth about our colleagues, at least not in any objective way. And, what's fascinating to me is that, it's other people see a lot more clearly. Now, we can actually measure this. We can measure the extent to which your predictions of your strengths and weaknesses versus other people's prediction of your strengths and weaknesses. And we did this study where we looked at, these are ratings, and we're talking about 1 million others here and 85,000 selves. So we looked at the ability, we took the self-rating of an individual, and what we tried to do was predict the overall rating with the self-score included in that overall rating. And then we had every other rater, boss, peer, direct report, individually try to predict. And the question is, and this is, what we're doing here is we're looking at the percent of variance accounted for. But what we found in our data is that others were twice as good at predicting your overall rating than you were. And we can graphically display this. We graphed people into the worst leaders, first to the 9th percentile, the best leaders, and we show the ratings from others versus the ratings of the self. And once again, the self ratings, there's a little bit of variance there, but what you see is it's almost a flat line, but the ratings from others really get the edge. What we find from that is if you rely on the self ratings, basically poor leaders, the worst leaders, they didn't see it. They don't get it. They just, there was this idea that if you ask people if they're above average drivers, what percentage is it, Jack? 85?
85% thinks
they're above average
drivers.
drivers.
Oh, yeah, yes.
And so nobody thinks they're that bad. But again, the fascinating thing is that people don't realize they're that good. People don't realize how effective they are and what they're effective at. And so if you think about your effectiveness, you have your self-perception. And that is important. We're not saying that we should just discount all of our self-perceptions, but it's when we take our self-perception and we learn from others what they see And if we can integrate those two, if we can bring those two together, then we do have truth, right? It's what we believe about ourselves and what other people see in us. That is really truth. Well, now I'm getting philosophical.
Okay, we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that we would like to leave you with a thought, an idea that we think could really improve the overall process of giving and receiving feedback in organizations. As you stand back and think about it, right now we are operating on this fundamental assumption that it's the responsibility of the manager to initiate the conversation with a subordinate, that he or she is the one who needs to kind of break the ice and have this discussion, whether it's a positive message or whether it's particularly a corrective or redirecting message. And we just expect feedback to trickle down gently from on high and cascade down through the organization. And there'll be these little rivers of feedback trickling through the entire kind of company. We'd like to kind of have you think about a very different idea and a different approach. What if we flipped the whole thing on its head and said, rather than expecting all feedback to kind of flow down, what if we said, how about reversing the order and say, maybe it should flow upward? Maybe the way to improve the whole feedback process is for people to ask for it, because now it has a totally different tone and a totally different emotional component. If managers ask their subordinates for feedback, think what an example that sets. Think how much more likely it is that they will be perceived as being an effective manager. We have some good data about that very fact, that when managers ask for feedback, they are perceived even more favorably than those who give feedback to their subordinates. Similarly, if employees are feeling that they're not getting sufficient feedback from their manager, maybe we need to encourage them to ask for it. Don't hesitate to ask your colleagues and your boss for her ideas about how you could be an even more effective employee. We just think that this whole fundamental culture of expecting feedback to always flow in one direction is something that really deserves and needs to be changed, because if people ask, it so dramatically changes the emotional dimension of feedback as a process.
Sure changes my frame of reference, doesn't it? If I ask for it, you know, I'm in a lot better position to receive it, right? And you know, because I've asked for it.
You're in control,
as opposed to you're going to give it to me. You're going to lay it on me, you know, and all of a sudden I'm defensive from the beginning. Yeah. So it does change a lot in that respect. So asking for feedback is an essential for success in life, unless you're a hermit. If you're a hermit, you don't need to ask for feedback. And if you think about why people don't ask, a lot of times people feel like they got enough feedback. And it's interesting, because if you look at this by age, the older we get, the less we ask. Right. Okay? Right. And so let me just close with this one last study where we looked at a person's willingness to ask for and act on feedback from others and a leader's overall effectiveness. And when you look at that, you know, you see this amazing conclusion that if you want to predict who's going to be an effective leader, just predict who's willing to ask for feedback. Because turns out, if you ask others for feedback, they'll give it to you, and you're more likely to listen to it and apply it, and that's going to improve your effectiveness. It's like one of the great secrets of life It's like, how do I be successful? Well, just ask other people for their advice, and they'll give it to you, and then sort of do that. And by asking, it puts us in that better position to actually doing something with it. Jack, this has been a really interesting topic for us. I know we've got papers on this that we've written, and if you'd like more information, you can go to our website and check there. And we've got an article that is pre-publication in Talent Quarterly on this that we're going to have, and we could send out a pre-publication version of that to you if you're interested. Give us a call.
Go to info@zengerfolkman.com, and we would be happy to.
And you know what? We'd love to hear your reactions to this. We got pretty animated about this idea that you know, that you're the only one that knows if you're good or bad, and you know, to me, that's a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for, you think about people who are engaging that way. I'm the one that knows, and they're not listening to the feedback of others. They're not in good shape.
Thanks for joining us on today's webinar, and we look forward to having you with us when we sponsor the next one.